COVID-19, rising above official experts and conspiracy theories alike, learning from Boccaccio. What worse a slave than that of fear, and what greater a teacher of the primacy of love over fear than Dante's heir, Boccaccio. Faced with the plague, the heroes of the Florentines' literary masterpiece, the Decamerone, do not even dream of fleeing for the sake of survival. When they leave the city of Florence, they do so insofar as they are moved by love of civility, or of poetry, as they understand it, compounded, to be sure, by repulsion at the sight of a visceral erosion of social life, but also, and most importantly, at the sight of civility's betrayal by people having exposed their corrupt nature from beneath a veneer of conformism, worn out by the sweeping of the plague across the city. Treading in the footsteps of Dante's Commedia, Boccaccio's Decamerone suggests unequivocally that in the face of physical danger, we should not be moved by fear, but by desire to pursue the good, if only where that desire is accompanied and indeed supported by repulsion in the face of people's intentional rejection of civility. Boccaccio's lesson is no longer understood by modernists, for whom freedom does not presuppose any transcendent common good, but merely external goods, subject to being lost, properly because they're never really possessed. Are we not supposed to fear the outer world of necessity, lest we lose the inner world of freedom? Boccaccio answers in the negative, inviting us to seek human freedom in outer life and divine necessity as its heart. Necessity, for Boccaccio, is not a Cartesian res extensa, matter devoid of meaning, but the point of both departure and return of freedom, of a free life that arises from and returns beyond all things subject to decay or susceptible to being destroyed. As a result, Boccaccio constantly views what is corruptible or what has a corrupt nature poetically in the light of the incorruptible, of what has an integral or pristine nature. Our poet is not overburdened by the sight of evil because, as all good Platonists, he sees it in the light of the good. In what manner of speech? As all good poets, Boccaccio sees evil in the element of poetry, which allows him to go through hell without being touched by it, to pierce evil without turning his back to the good, to have his eyes fixed on the evil before him in the very act of seeing the good shining through it from behind. Evil, we might say, is an open window for the Platonist. No less than his mentor, Dante, Boccaccio fosters a poetry akin to that of the biblical God who, in the Garden of Eden, warns that to seek out truth aside from paternal law is to fall prey of evil. Had Eve learned Boccaccio's lesson prior to being challenged by evil surfacing from within our humanity, she would not have believed the cunning insinuating that the Father's prohibition is grounded in jealousy, or that evil is best known outside of the isle of paternal grace. It was Eve's lack of a poetic education, her imperfect optimism, that allowed her to be duped by the spirit of conspiracy. Some today might object that to see evil in the light of the good is not good enough, that we need to reenact Eve's deed rather than follow Boccaccio's example. Yet Boccaccio hardly ignores, or even only underestimates, the gravity of evil. Neither does he optimistically see evil as a necessary stepping stone to the future. Indeed, he treats evil dispassionately as a problem that lingers permanently on the surface of life. But then, how can he remain dispassionate in the face of evil? Simply stated, in virtue of his way of life, or, to be more accurate, by finding himself on an open path, stretching from and back to the roots of problems, with respect to their varying manifestations. Boccaccio's dispassionate dealing with evil is, again, characteristically Platonic. He examines evil, yet always in the deep-seated light of the good. There surely is nothing demeaning about this course, nothing childish, nothing preventing Boccaccio from tasting the fruit of evil. On the contrary, Boccaccio's way is the only one by which he could attain to evil's ground. Now, Boccaccio's study of evil points us back to the good, given a Platonic understanding of knowledge as recognition, the Greek anamnesis. Let us lend some thought to this point. The child's amazement in the face of all that he sees signals the character of seeing as recognizing. The child sees everything approximately the way adults find something they had lost. Children's amazement often prompts adults to regard children as naively seeing anything as if for the first time. Yet the amazement is simply a sign of children's lack of the prejudices, preventing many of us from appreciating the necessary bond between our experience and its condition of possibility, between the varying contents of our experience and their original place in the mind. In what mind? We are naturally inclined to answer by divining a pure mind, unfettered by varying experiences. Children's amazement, then, makes sense in so-called Platonic terms as sign of natural awareness that all that we see outwardly or superficially is originally seated in the mind, even if children do not yet realize that they have somehow lost the mind in question, even as it has not lost them. In any case, for the child, as for Platonists, to know something is to possess something in the mind, that is, to see that something in terms of a common form, an eternal idea, indeed a permanent problem. Everything here is an invitation to reflect, that is, to live the life of the mind. At the antipodes of the child stands the cynical adult, who has grown bored with appearances, collecting experiences as an antiquarian might, or for the sake of stalking them. Here, the mind decays into a dark receptacle of appearances, a cage of shadows, whereby all we see stands as a mere distraction unto death. Such is the condition of a sick mind, a mind that grasps all appearances for the sake of forgetting their origins, or natural telos. The sick, cynical mind is a mind of forgetfulness, a mind betraying childhood, the natural cradle of poetry, for which all we see is filled with gods. If the proper place of things is in the mind, then it makes sense to conceive things as speaking to us of their original abode. By the same token, it makes sense to speak of an ethics of knowing, whereby we study by way of returning to things as original contents of an immortal mind. Yet, this is not what studying means for most of us. Indeed, in fitting our experiences in the mind, most of us try to use experiences to build, that is, for the sake of empowerment. Others take an aesthetic approach, seeing for the sake of seeing. Capitalists and scientists, or mathematical minds, exemplify distinctively the two aforementioned approaches to experience. On the one hand, we have people who want to use what we see as building blocks in the context of greater endeavors. On the other hand, we have people who want to see as an end in itself, with the understanding that there is always something new to see. Clearly, scientists are closer in spirit to children than are merchants. Yet, both merchants and scientists, pure scientists, forsake our natural impulse to rise to the original content of the free mind by retracing the fleeting to the permanent, the superficial to the fundamentally meaningful. Now, today, pure scientists tend to resent the hegemony merchants have gained over the past decades, if not centuries, in providing incentives for science, incentives that usually come at a dire price for scientists, who are ever more obliged to follow the money, as the expression goes, that is, to submit to unscientific dictates. Our hapless scientists see no way to escape the fatal grip of mercantile demands. Yet, they do have a way out, which would consist of admitting to an ethics of science, well beyond the instrumentalist, industry-bound, homonymous discipline they are already familiar with. For the ethics that scientists really need in order to be free entails a manner of life by which the pre-scientific, common sense contents of the mind are restored to their proper, inalienable dignity as original contents of a permanently free mind. All is originally good, as Boccaccio's Platonic lesson would have it, so that we need not fear evil. We need not remain perplexed by it, and so we certainly do not need to be overcome by it. Conversely, we can cultivate awareness of evil without reducing it to a banality that may thereupon be either integrated into a machinery of production, see the shrewd use capitalists make of vice, or dismissed for lack of cognitive content, see the indifference our scientists reserve for values beyond the scope of their specialized pursuits. Now, the inherence of evil in human pursuits is manifest archetypically in what is known as conspiracy. Conspiring is as old a practice as the age of Cain, though the cunning and scheming entailed by conspiracy run deep in our common veins. We tend to underestimate them today to the extent that we abide under the sway of modernity's promise to raise us into a world of universal transparency, a world as broad and comprehensive as it is shallow. Modernity tends to lose its taste buds for the common roots of conspiracy, relegating the practice of conspiring to the private recesses of psychotic imaginations, as if conspiracy were alien to the public sphere, as if the course of public life were defined solely by the modern, transparent, instrumental reason of Cartesian, clear and distinct ideas, and by the unconscious or material currents of historical change. What is intentionally left out is the notion that the public sphere, indeed the republic, our common world, is significantly affected by intentions that run deeper than the clarity and distinction of Cartesian formulas of speech. The traditional term designating a deep intention influencing the course of republics is providence, although it must be said here that providence is traditionally viewed at war with forces of destruction, of perversion, of distraction from what is or was originally intended, namely the republic as common good. Thus does medieval man present the world as only deceptively guided by the devil, but as fundamentally guided by the incarnate divine Logos. The discourse dominating our times turns its back on any traditional notion of providence, whether Christian or pagan, falling back instead on a Cartesian dichotomy of res extensa and res cogitans, of materiality devoid of sense and of sense imposed mechanically upon senseless materiality, as may be clinical models upon our common life. The traditional notion of deep intentionality is reduced to that of cunning expressed on the level of superficiality of modern calculative instrumental discourse or reason. No doubt, classical antiquity had experience of the seeds of what 20th century Machiavellians will call realpolitik, but the ancients and medieval alike do not speak much of vice. They rather focus on virtue. Their discourses and lives take their bearings from what is good rather than from what is evil, even and especially before the challenge of exploring the dark in search of the light hidden within it. Now, cunning has always stood as the ostensive center of politics, branching out to its remotest margins. Yet, today, in the wake of psychological subjectivism, we tend to retrace cunning to private quarters in the hope that the fabric of public rules and regulations succeed in keeping cunning at bay. Cunning is treated as banality easily contained, administered, and overall ostracized from the public sphere, so that the very thought that it might permeate political life as such tends to be shunned as itself the product of cunning. The very thought that politics may be deeply seated in conspiracy irks most of us as a fanciful conspiracy, or as what is often spoken of with derogatory intent in terms of conspiracy theory. The problem with what is often condemned today as conspiracy theory is not that it seeks out conspiracy at the heart of political life, but that it reduces conspiracy within the straitjacket of ad hominem attacks, preferring vulgar witch hunting to the cultivation of awareness of permanent problems, and thus too of evil as lingering in everyday life throughout its manifold manifestations. What is often abhorred as conspiracy theory would be fully reasonable, indeed eminently justifiable, where it sought to uncover the general ideas comprehensible on common grounds, guiding human action, helping us assess which are better than others, or which, if any, deserve being rejected as simply bad. Now, one of the ideas that, if only indirectly, prompts many today to reject a serious examination of irreducible evil in public life is the idea that politics is merely a technical ordeal devoid of deep meaning. There is supposed to be no science aimed at discovering the deep meaning of politics. Indeed, politics itself is supposed to be a science only in a metaphorical or derivative sense, where true science would be that of nature. This view overturns an older view of Socratic stamp, on account of which the only true science we have access to is a political one, whereas in the case of nature, the physical, we would have no science proper. On this older view, which was originally to supplant that of pre-Socratic naturalists or materialists, our knowledge of nature as nature remains ineluctably uncertain, insofar as we as natural scientists, or as people who believe that science is primarily of nature, do not know nature's own nature. To speak in generality, today we have not even asked as regards what we might mean by nature. Reducing nature to a Cartesian res extensa is not adequate for the purpose of addressing our problems. Where would that res extensa come from? Why would it be there in the first place, as something ready at hand for us? What would it be in itself, aside from our consciousness of it? Would we be simply obliged to fight it without worrying about its own nature or about what it is in itself? The Socratic tradition tells us that there is no science of nature, but a science of the human. Why? Is it because of the very nature of nature? Is nature in itself unknowable? Is it there to be controlled pragmatically? Or is it there as a stepping stone for us to return to a science of man? But then, what is the proper end of a science of man? Is it for us to hide from nature, or for us to discover the nature of nature, or to divine the truth about nature? What happens when the science of man is cut off from the divine nature of nature? What happens when nature is reduced to a worldly, material affair devoid of deep cognitive import? In both cases, we have a flattening of science, a reduction of knowledge to superficiality. Now, it is this superficiality that has brought us to our present condition of incapacity to respond effectively to evil or its tyrannical exercise. Alienated from all quests for deep meaning, postmodern man stands, nay, falls, hapless before the rise of tyranny, as if before the rise of a mind-boggling ineluctability. Postmodern man retreats before public evil into ever-increased privacy, forsaking the originally political character of community life. As a result of his flight into virtuality, postmodern man lingers as a physical, moral, and intellectual wreck. He is too weak to build real communities. All he is capable of is to live virtually, or less euphemistically, as a physically, morally, and intellectually anesthetized impostor. How has he reached this degree of decadence? He has let himself be seduced into it by ideas promulgated by a ruling class that has found it convenient to let peoples multiply, flattered by the illusion of numbers, of the empowerment supposedly offered by them. Modern population growth is integral to a modern strategy to use people to serve the buildup of a global market tyranny and to weaken people to the point where they decay into a condition of physical, moral, and intellectual servitude. Too tired, fearful, and unreflective to venture into real community life, postmodern man is easily driven to let his life be lived on a screen, or, as we say, online, where he is systematically fished within a worldwide web of distractions from his own life. Virtuality becomes his modus operandi and forma mentis, his way of life and mental frame, as he projects his very physical identity away from open spaces into atomistic reclusion or voluntary house arrests. A few decades ago, an honest scholar spoke of modern man having driven himself into a second Platonic cave in the recesses of the first, and so as to hide from fundamental problems. The second cave that modern man comes to live and die for, especially insofar as eternity means nothing to him, is a multi-directional tunnel of illusions in which all that really counts is a government-sponsored instruction sheet to everyday living, rules and regulations, then, as an end in itself. Our second cave is reminiscent of Leibniz's monad insofar as neither has, so to speak, a window onto what transcends it. Thus, in our second cave, discourse is radically alienated from the very question of a right transcending positive right. The very question of natural right is mute, even denigrated, if not simply demonized, in the public sphere. The immediate political significance of the de facto abolition of politically relevant appeals to natural right is exemplified, if only indirectly, by what a character of Solzhenitsyn's novel Cancer Ward stated about Stalin's responsibility for the murder of millions of civilians. Had crowds of thousands of people not applauded the tyrant in the first place in the public square, none of the atrocities Stalin is infamous for would have taken place. Otherwise put, where people uphold positive right as the highest right, the dictates of the latest tyrant on the podium are all too easily executed. Thereupon, the absence of protests from the public sphere is reputed as a sign of political stability. To paraphrase Stalin himself, if nobody is complaining, well, then there must be no problem. Obviously, in the postmodern consolidation of the second cave, old problems remain. We have only pretended to distance ourselves from them, as we merely and continuously spin our backs to them. Otherwise put, no matter how far we may be from truth, truth will always be with us. Our distance, then, is a matter of self-inflicted alienation, of intubation, as it were, lest we be bothered by the sight, not merely of the open sky, but of the very thought of it. In rising back to the ideas that guide the political policies of our age, we face immediately that of virtuality, of hypermediation, of a frantic flight away from direct confrontation with problems. And yet, ironically, we are cajoled into believing that technology offers us unprecedented direct contact with the whole wide world. We are speaking here of the very technology that is supposed to spare us the trouble of seeking truth through ethical engagement with real human communities. The ethics that was once invoked as key to truth is now dismissed as at best an irrelevant commodity. What takes precedence over it is mass-mediated news, driving us systematically into a world of digital masks we pretentiously call identities. Thus, for instance, in our age of selfies, we no longer need a neighbor to take our photograph, insofar as we can pretend to be our neighbor. Who needs a real other when you can feign one yourself in our age of imposture? We crown ourselves, so to speak, metaphysically with our own identity, without having to really expose ourselves to another. Metaphysics absorbs ethics, which thereby becomes a farce. All is pretension, all is fake. To be is to appear, the ultimate sophism. Hamlet's question is mute. To be or not to be, to live or to let oneself be lived. The alternative is supposed to be resolved in a synthesis wherein we live most fully by giving ourselves to be lived. We work hard not to have to live or to create an avatar that may live for us. The Christian roots of modern secularism surface in the most glaring manner. Whereas the Christian of old could say that not he, but divine Logos lived in him, our postmodern man transposes himself into a technological Logos so that he may pretend to live in it. Whereas in the Christian case, I die so that I may be reborn in terms of the divine Logos. In the postmodern world, I survive virtually or through technological mediation. I strive to sleep, sparing myself the trouble of dying without much concern for any rebirth that death might have yielded. In short, rather than struggling to awaken, our postmodern homunculus struggles to sleep. Yet, he feels far too weak to struggle for himself. He needs a machinery of technocratic directives and propaganda to keep him struggling, to compel him to pedal on the wheel of postmodernity's kaleidoscopic distractions. The directives feed us the certainties that keep us pedaling, divine-like certainties occupying the place that, in earlier ages, only knowledge of the nature of nature might have been granted. The fact that we do not know today the nature of what we talk about, the fact that our authorities, our authoritative experts, do not know it either, does not disturb our modus operandi. We pedal precisely because we do not know why. The COVID-19 worldwide ordeal has not produced the situation described here. It has merely rendered it more evident than it had previously been. Now, we have billions of people under the sway of a tiny elite of experts on viruses, for whom, to cite a casual confession made recently by eminent French virologist Didier Raoult, viruses remain fundamentally incomprehensible. And yet, masses of people bow to virologic experts, as if to divinely ordained priests, seeking salvation from viruses that our virtual priests can only pretend to comprehend and predict. In a similar vein, we trust virus tests results to tell us whether or not we are infected by the COVID-19 virus, even if, and here I report from various public disclosures, testers can be already infected prior to testing. Testers are designed to give an 80% rate of positive results, and testers show positive results for all those having received a flu shot, especially a trivalent. In a similar vein, we trust virus test results to tell us whether or not we are infected by the COVID-19 virus, even if, and here I report from various public disclosures, testers can be already infected prior to testing. Testers are designed to give an 80% rate of positive results, and testers are at least likely to show positive results for those having received a flu shot, especially a trivalent, over the past 10 years. Yet, the aforementioned technical details are merely one facet of the vaster technical problem of determining how many people are real carriers of the COVID-19 as opposed to being merely suspected or supposed to be carriers. In short, and without indulging any further in the elaboration of technical data, not only do our world-famed virologists not understand the virus they are supposed to defend us from, neither do they know who is really carrying it. Indeed, they do not even know, as opposed to merely guessing, whether or not the COVID-19 functions as a significant comorbose death factor. Yet, ignorance can go two ways, insofar as it leaves us open to two possibilities. Either we are, or we are not carriers of a virus that no one really understands. The meaning of our choice of answer will depend only marginally upon the expert we adopt to back our choice. The key to our choice will rather be our prior, tacit, fundamental choice between fear and desire or love, between a life driven by fear and one guided by desire. As we rise from the discrete masks of the COVID-19 theater to true faces, we stumble upon this fundamental problem transcending the confines of any and all conspiracy theories, the conflict between two irreducible ways of life, a centrifuge one compelled by fear, and a centripetal one guided by desire of one's own, which is to say, of truth.